Merhabalar, değerli izleyiciler. Sabahtan beri devam etmekte olan 1 Mart Gelecek Günü kutlamalarımızın devam eden akışının içerisinde sıra Profesör Doktor Peter Bishop'ın Belirsiz Geleceğimiz diye adlandırdığı sunumuna geldi. Ee, Profesör Bishop 1982'den bu yana gelecek çalışmalarını sürdürüyor eğitmen olarak. Uzgörü akademik programlarını kurgulayıp, tasarlayıp, uygulayıp Amerika Houston Üniversitesi'nde lisans, yüksek lisans, master, doktora seviyesinde eğitmenliğini yapan ve 2013 senesinde de profesör olarak emekli olan e, bir fütürist. O yıllardan sonra misyonu gelecek olan eğitimcileri teşvik etmek ve desteklemek için bir organizasyon kuruyor. Teach the Future, geleceği öğretmek. Biz de buna gelecek bilgisi dedik. Ve bu yapıyı bütün dünyaya yaymaya çalışıyor. Olumlu bir gelecek sağlamak için dünyada bir değişiklik yapabilseydiniz bu ne olurdu diye sormuşlar kendisine. Verdiği cevap iki boyutlu. Bir tanesi öğrencilerimiz hala son birkaç yüzyıldaki bilgilerle bu yüzyılda gelecekle başa çıkmaları için eğitiliyor. Bunun artık sorgulanması gerekiyor. Çünkü ikisi artık birbirinden her geçen gün ayrılan bir yol gibi. Bu nedenle kendisinin önerisi değişiklik dünyadaki her öğrencinin, her öğrenci ebeveyninin ve öğretmeninin yapması gereken şu anki dünyadan ziyade yaşayacakları, gelecekteki dünyadaki değişimi almak için uzgörü ve gelecek çalışmalarına başlamasıdır. Ki Teach the Future diye adlandırdığı projeksiyonunda tam bunun üzerine kurgulamış bir yapıya sahip. Şimdi kendisi bugün aramıza katılamayacağını daha önceden belirtmişti. Kaliforniya tarafında oradaki işleriyle ilgili olarak ama bize sunumunu ve videosunu ikisini bir arada gönderdi. Şimdi rica ediyorum lütfen videoya başlayabiliriz. İyi seyirler.
An organization called Teach the Future. I have a background in future studies, mainly at the University of Houston, where I was privileged to lead a master's degree in future studies for many years. It was actually the first degree program in future studies in the world, of which there are now maybe a half a dozen or a dozen such programs. Retiring in 2013, I created this organization called Teach the Future, which is an attempt to bring exactly the same futures thinking that we were teaching graduate students to all students in secondary school, even elementary school, and of course in undergraduate college. I'd like to talk to you about future studies, its role in education, and its role in history, and how we are developing a new way of thinking about the future that World Future today is celebrating. Old World Futures was, as we know from history, people knew about the future, people knew about change, and they knew the daily cycle of day and night. They knew the seasonal cycle of spring and summer and autumn. And of course, they knew the life cycle, which is that every living being is born, comes into the world, grows and develops, and ultimately ages and passes away. So they knew about change. What they did not know about, however, was the change in the society. J.B. Bury wrote this book called The Idea of Progress. It was about progress, the concept of progress beginning in the 19th century. Prior to that, people were basically born into exactly the same role that they left, and there was no mobility. There was no moving up or moving out. You couldn't go anywhere. This was a society of what we call ascribed characteristics. They were not chosen. And as a result, people didn't realize that society was itself changing because in their life, they experience. Now, the king may die, or the war may come about, or a famine may occur, but the structure of society up until this new time was basically fixed. The 18th century, of course, was the time of the invention of machines that took over work. And people realized that, well, my job and our society is different than it was for my parents and different than it was for my grandparents. They were fixed. We're now moving. Things are actually happening. And as a result, I realized that, gee, I guess it will be different for my children. So this concept of the future, as we think about it today, was first born in this Industrial Revolution. Two French authors were thinking about this in the 1780s, and this English author, Thomas Malthus, also didn't think it was going to be so much progress. It would be a continuation of poverty and disease. So we had, even in those old days, a difference of opinion about how the future would emerge. In the 19th century, we saw the beginning of social science, like sociology, which was my degree, the appearance of science fiction, and the appearance of utopias that said this could be much better than it is today, and the future could be different. And those were very, very powerful ideas in the 19th century. The 20th century opened with a very famous author, H.G. Wells, who wrote many things, science fiction included, but he wrote a nonfiction review of the 20th century from the very first year of that century in 1901. It had a wonderful number of things that actually did come about. The Harvard Business School created what was first what you would consider to be the first model of strategic planning, how to build a business and what the elements were and how to plan and create it as you go along. In the late 1920s and the early 30s, William Ogburn, a sociologist, was commissioned by Herbert Hoover to gather all the data together that we had about trends and how trends could be different in the future. Those two actions, Harvard View and the Ogburn study, really resulted in, therefore, the creation of two new professions. A profession of forecasting that is basically the descriptions of the future with graphs and charts and mathematics. Of course, econometrics and trend extrapolation were the basics of that particular forecasting profession. Also came along a profession of planning. Prior to that, people pretty well did what they thought was best, but there was no really systematic. And now we have systematic tools for doing project management and planning and processing. And these are all progress. There's nothing wrong with those. Those are excellent tools. And I think the 20th century was the beneficiary of these tools. On the other hand, each of these tools required a certain set of assumptions. Those assumptions were not bad, as assumptions are, but if you're going to do trend extrapolation, you have to believe that the trend will continue until the time horizon, until the forecasted period, whether it's 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. You have to believe, if you have an econometric model, that the model will be valid until that time, that the future will be like the past in all relevant ways, and that nothing unexpected will occur. Well, of course, that's an interesting assumption in these days. Planning also had its own assumptions. And when we want to create a business or we want to introduce a new product, we know how to do that step by step. We know the steps. All the steps will be completed successfully and on time, and therefore we will achieve the result that we plan for. Again, nothing unexpected will occur. Of course, how valid are those now in the 21st century, not to mention in the middle of this pandemic? We knew we couldn't predict the future, but believe it or not, most people still today are doing that. They're doing it, not that it's not their fault, they just don't know what the alternative is. And that alternative, I submit, is the appearance of future studies and strategic foresight as a new way of thinking and acting on the future. Here are the disruptions that put these assumptions to rest. Since the 1970s, we have had a dozen or more disruptions that have changed every business and industry, and indeed our own lives. And in that sense, doing extrapolation becomes less and less valid and therefore more and more risky. So what are we supposed to do instead? Well, there were a number of thinkers in the 1960s and 70s that did start thinking about this. Fred Polak was the head of planning in the Netherlands in the 1950s. His country, of course, had experienced the devastation of World War II, my gosh, and World War I. And how are we supposed to deal with the future from here? Herman Kahn worked with the Rand Corporation and the Department of Defense in the United States to think about the awfulness of nuclear war and what might happen. Rachel Carson was an environmentalist, one of the first actually, to think about the effect that industry was having on the environment. Bertrand de Juvenal, Alvin Toffler, Donella Meadows, all made their contributions in that period. It was the beginning of thinking about the future in a new and different way. Today, we have those same people and many others. We have, as I said, degree programs that were begun in the 1960s and are growing and emerging today. We have membership organizations like the Federation, the World Future Studies Federation, the Millennium Project, which is promoting World Future Day, and now the Association of Professional Futurists. We have academic journals, we have consultancies, we have government agencies that are doing this type of thing. This is a real field that is changing the future as we go along. It's not, however, so far, changing what happens in school. I'd like to review how we learned about the future, we adults in the world today. We did have some knowledge and we picked up some impressions about the future, not all entirely wrong, but not entirely correct either. And we picked those up in three different ways. We picked up a knowledge of the future in science class. In science class, the future is predictable. You can put the equations in, take the boundary conditions, do the calculations, come out with a result. And if you get that result in your laboratory, then you will get a good grade. You will graduate. You will go on to college. The future is predictable in a science class. It's like a road or a river that is going to go forward and reach a destination. So most people think of the future as that destination. We have to figure out where the road's going to end, where the river is going to end. Another place we picked up our impression of the future is in history class. History was treated as a story, a three-part story. The people in that story knew their past. They had some idea of their present, but they had no idea of their future. We know their future, but they didn't know their future. So it seemed like it was kind of one thing after the other, cause, effect, a chain of dominoes all falling, more or less inevitably handling. What we left out of history was the uncertainties involved, was the fact that people did not know the outcome of the war or the outcome of the new invention or the outcome of the new leadership. We knew that and we treated it as a complete story, even though those people lived it as the same way we're living it. We don't know the outcome of our actions in our time today. And finally, we were treated to another version of the future from our parents, our teachers, our preachers, ministers, counselors, and every motivational speaker you've ever heard about, saying you can be anything you want to be. If you believe it enough, you work hard enough, you can be that thing. Well, that's partially true. You get more of what you work for than if you don't work for it. On the other hand, there are constraints. And so each of these was an impression we got out of school that actually didn't track the future as it is. And absolutely, we were confused and teachers were confused. And so that's the reason why we didn't ever mention the future in those classes, because they didn't know how to teach it by telling us what was going to happen. They knew how to teach the past by telling what did happen. They knew how to teach science by saying, if you do this, then this other thing will happen. But they didn't know how to talk about the future. And in that sense, we just never mentioned it. It's never brought up. And education, because of this, not because, but the foundation of education is basically to pass along the knowledge and the experience of previous generations, passing that to the new generation so that they can be prepared for their world and the successful world that they go. But in this sense, education is very backwardly looking. It's taking everything from the past and not really thinking about the future. But given the pace of change, given the disruptions that we're experiencing these days, our children's future, and indeed our grandchildren's future, could very well be very different. And that the knowledge and the experience of the past, while it may be helpful, it is not going to be sufficient. And we have to think about the future differently, and we have to think about it explicitly. Two ideas I have that I'd like to share. One of those is that is the future like a river or a road with a single destination? And we would submit no. It is many destinations, more like a river delta that gets to the sea. Which channel is the water? Which channel is the boat? Which channel is the log going to go down? We don't know ahead of time. It is uncertain. Or more like the branches of a tree, not like a straight pole. There are actually three futures. The expected future, which everybody knows about, and which is the result of trend extrapolation, saying if things continue the way they go today, this is where we will end up. But that's only one of the futures that we should be talking about. There are alternative futures, sometimes called scenarios. What if? What if this were to happen? What if that were to happen? We should actually make those explicit. And the world of strategic foresight today is developing the tools for doing that for businesses and for government. And finally, there is a preferred future. We have a better world in our mind and our visions and our goals, and we should be working for that. So thinking about the future in these three ways is the best way we should do it. It's not the way we learned it, but it is the way we should be teaching our children today. Excuse me. All right, so what does thinking about this require? Well, I call it a revolution in thought because there are three things that we have to change about how we have thought about the future. First of all, most people, most experts have a very narrow view and a deep view of their field. Economists, technologists, business people. But everybody should be also thinking about looking over the horizon, looking towards the horizon, thinking of the larger world and thinking more widely, not narrowly or deeply only about the future. We should be thinking more deeply about the assumptions that we're making. The future is not established. It doesn't exist, indeed. It exists in our minds and in our thoughts and in our images, in our imagination. But our imagination is shaped by assumptions. What's possible? What's likely? What's impossible? And if we challenge those assumptions, we will get different futures. And finally, the future is a long time coming. It's not just next year or the year after. It could be 10, 20 years. We build buildings that last 30 or 40 years. We raise children that last, we hope, 70 or 80 years. We should be thinking about the world that far ahead as we go forward. And the other side of this is, can you have any future that you want? Well, planning is a profession, and people do planning. They build buildings, they build roads, they build machines. But influencing the future is not like building. It is more like growing. It is more organic. Anyone who has raised a child realizes that you can have a plan, but that child also has a say, and it will, in some cases, go according to the plan, in other cases, not. So parents have to be resilient and adaptable, and so we should be talking to our children about being empowered, about taking control and influencing their future, not in a step-by-step way, however, but in a adaptable, resilient way. Unfortunately, resilience in the midst of the pandemic has become a very big word, a very big goal. But are schools teaching students to be resilient? Well, they are forced to be now because they're at home and learning in many cases and using the information technology rather than being in a classroom. But school itself is all about right and wrong answers, not about, oh, what do I do in this case or what do I do in that case? And finally, to work with others, to be collaborative and get things put together. So our view is that we should have not only a profession of future studies and strategic foresight, but that everyone should have the ability to understand and to manage change in order to be successful in this century. You don't have to be a futurist to know the various fundamental things that I've just been talking about. It's what we call futures literacy. We have media literacy now, digital literacy, all kinds of literacies. Futures literacy is about understanding change and being able to influence it using the tools that everyone. You don't have to be an accountant to have financial literacy. You don't have to be a technologist to have digital literacy. So you don't have to be a futurist to have futures literacy, but it is a set of skills that we should be teaching our students. So Teach the Future is an organization dedicated to that purpose. Our aspiration is that every student is prepared to navigate an uncertain world and has the agency to imagine and create their preferred future. I'm not going to see that aspiration fulfilled, but we are working very hard in that direction. Our job, our mission, is to teach futures thinking skills to students and educators around the world and to inspire them to influence their futures, making them empowered and skillful at being able to work towards a preferred future for themselves, for their families, for their communities, nations, and indeed for the world as a whole. We should teach the future as well as the past in every school. We should prepare students for tomorrow by teaching the future today. It's my pleasure now to give you an example of where that is actually happening right here, right there in Istanbul. I introduce you to Sevinç Ersin, who is the owner and the principal of Gen Koleji, a school that is implementing futures thinking, and she is now going to take over and share some of the details of her school's efforts to bring all this thinking to their students.